Video is now in session, and with Kamala Harris all but confirmed to be the next Democratic nominee for president in the 2024 election, let's now shift our attention to the factors that are still changeable between now and November. So when it comes to how voters decide who to vote for in an election, it usually comes down to three sections. First, policy changes. Second, social climate in America. And third, the candidates themselves. How are the candidates viewed in terms of their quality? So in this specific election, we see there are two things that can change between now and November that fall under these three categories, that being Gaza and as well as RFK Jr. And the reason why that's so is it's explainable in the first section, which is policy. Americans, tend to vote for presidents who have made substantial changes to American policy. And at this point between now and November, it's unlikely we're going to see anything pass through Congress because there's a division between the Republican-controlled House and the Democratic-controlled Senate. And then in terms of what Biden can do in executive orders, he's mostly done everything that he can do in that realm, including trying to address the student debt crisis and as well as immigration. And so now we're left with the final pillar, which is foreign policy and how the Biden administration conducts diplomacy. It seems like that in the Ukraine war, it's going to end in a stalemate, or not even end, but just end up in a stalemate by the time election day comes. Whereas in Gaza, there's a higher potential of a ceasefire. And the reason why a ceasefire is important is because it changes the debate in terms of, or I guess more specifically, the argument that the Trump campaign has been making, which is that the Biden administration is incompetent at handling foreign policy and is detrimental to promoting peace around the world. If Blinken, who has said that they are now at the 10-yard line in negotiations between Hamas and Israel, if they are able to carry through and surmount that last element of these ceasefire talks, then Harris can basically argue that the Biden administration is for peace, that they do want peace in a timely manner, and this is the evidence for that. And that's also, and this particularly is important in this election because it also extends to the second section of what Americans consider when they're voting, which is the social climate. If you remember back in April, May, and June, there were a lot of protests around the United States at college campuses. And it really showed the divisions within the Democratic Party on this issue in Gaza. You had older Democrats who were more hawkish on Israel, who remember more about the Israeli fight for independence, or the Jewish fight for independence back in the 1950s. And then you also have younger Democrats who are more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and the humanitarian disaster that has been happening in Gaza. For that section of the Democratic base, they are very frustrated with how the Biden administration has been conducted in Gaza. And so by achieving a ceasefire, it helps Democrats unify on this issue. And that is even more important considering that you have a lot of Arab Americans that live in Michigan and also a high concentration of Arab American voters in the state of Pennsylvania, who care about this issue. And so if Democrats are able to achieve a ceasefire, then these voters are more likely to go out to the polls and support Kamala Harris. Now, what can Republicans do on this issue? They're not necessarily the ones in a governing majority, nor are they in the White House, but they can still make some, albeit immoral, but they can still make some moves on this issue. If you remember back in 1980, there was the Iran hostage crisis under the Carter administration, where Iran would not allow U.S. diplomats from their country to come back to the United States. And in that scenario, you had the Reagan campaign and more broadly the Republicans tried to delay the release of those hostages until after the election so that Republicans could campaign against Carter as being weak on foreign policy and weak on securing democracy against autocracies around the world. And so Trump and the Republicans can try to do something similar here, especially because Benjamin Netanyahu seems to find more favors among the Republicans than the Democrats, as the Republicans are more hawkish on Israel and Israel defense aid. But that has yet to be seen, and that is why this is one of the major things that can change between now and 2024. The other thing is RFK Jr., and that goes to the third section of what Americans consider when they're voting, which is candidate quality. The reason why RFK Jr. is still an unknown and still changeable between now and 2024 is because Kamala Harris is now the new Democratic nominee. And so if RFK Jr. Still is able to sustain the percentages that he has, that generally helps whoever's not in the White House, which in this case is Donald Trump, because it siphons votes out of the majority party, which right now is the Democrats. And furthermore, typically, if you have a third party that is popular, that indicates that Americans are frustrated with the status quo and that they want change. But now that change has been made on the ballot box, that now we need to figure out what the effects that will have on RFK's candidacy. And that goes to the idea of why do people support RFK Jr. in the first place. There are several theories, one being that at the time, Joe Biden, who was running as the presumptive nominee, and Donald Trump are the two oldest candidates for president in U.S. history. And so for many voters, especially younger voters, they might have wanted something different, something more of a change and a distraction, or not a distraction, but a shift away from the status quo. And RFK Jr. provided that by being an independent and by being seen as this kind of candidate that runs both right to the right on economy and to the left on social issues. But with Kamala Harris now in the ring, perhaps many of the younger voters that support RFK Jr. might be willing to support Kamala Harris because Kamala Harris is a lot younger and maybe more in touch with younger voters and their concerns. Or it could be that Kamala Harris is seen as more incompetent based off of her comments made as vice president on issues like immigration. And so those same supporters that defected from Joe Biden and Donald Trump to RFK Jr. might still stay in that camp. We will have to see what happens to that between, again, now and November, 4 months from now. But yeah, those are the two issues that can still change in this election. Everything else, like immigration and the economy, the statistics are pretty much set in stone, and whatever the statistics are today are most likely going to be the talking points of the Democrats and the Republicans for the next 4 months. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.